Ready? Well, good morning. We'll get things kicked off and started. It's 10 o'clock. We want to welcome everyone that is visiting here in person, and also we know there are several who are online watching and participating today, so we thank you for your participation and being involved. My name is Brandon Wolf. I'm the Idaho State Controller. This is the second part of a four-part series, and if you're unable to see or watch the first session, which you should really go back and watch, on Transparent Idaho, I'd highly recommend that. But key part, we're super excited for this second part today. And also on upcoming, our next two sessions, October 25th and one in the end of November. But our next one in October will be on Idaho Open Public Meeting Law. This is in partnership with IDOG, which is the Idahoans for Openness in Government, whose board is made up of people from inside and outside of government, the media, civic organizations, and more. Open government is the cornerstone of a free society. Our Idaho legislature has affirmed Idaho's commitment to open government by enacting Idaho public record laws initially in 1990 and recodifying it in 2015. These laws were meant to protect each citizen's right to monitor the actions of state and local government entities by providing access to these governmental records. There is a balancing act of competing interests between public access and an individual's right to privacy. I am truly looking forward to today to learn and understand more myself about campaign finance and lobbying work from our Idaho expert, Secretary of State Phil McGrain. But before our Secretary McGrain joins us here on stage, I'd like to introduce and thank and welcome, and please welcome Betsy Russell, who is a retired and former reporter from the Idaho Press and is the president of IDOG. And with that, I'd like to turn and welcome Betsy Russell for your work and all your effort in initiating and getting this going. Thank you so much, Betsy.
Thanks. Welcome, everyone. I'm Betsy Russell. It doesn't seem like there are that many people in the room here, but 80% of the participants in this workshop are online, watching us and participating on the stream. So welcome to everybody, both in person and online. I am the president of IDOG, which is a nonprofit coalition for openness in government and is affiliated with the National Freedom of Information Coalition, like similar organizations in most states. There's more about us at our website, openidaho.org. During our program today, if you have questions, you can submit them if you're in the room by writing them on one of the provided cards and just hold it up and a volunteer will come take your questions. Or if you are online, or if you prefer, you can email your questions to idogquestions@gmail.com. Also, after this, probably a few days after this, a full recording of this session will be available on our website. If you are an attorney, thanks to our partnership with Attorneys for Civic Education, you can receive continuing legal education credit through the Idaho State Bar for participating in today's session. Please sign up on the list in the back of the room or email your name, bar number, and email address to the IDOG Questions email address. I'm now very pleased to introduce our lead presenter today. Phil McGrain is a fourth-generation Idahoan who says in his official bio that his, quote, happy, honest approach to public service earned him the opportunity to serve as Idaho's 28th Secretary of State. And anyone who knows Phil, that rings true. Born in Pocatello, Phil holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington, a master's in public administration from Boise State University, and a law degree from the University of Denver. He started working for Ada County elections in 2005, counting punch cards and recruiting poll workers. He went on to serve as a law clerk to the United States Election Assistance Commission, as chief deputy county clerk for Ada County, and then as the elected county clerk starting in 2018. He was elected Idaho Secretary of State in 2022 with 72% of the vote. A focus of his is sharing insights and analytics aimed at making elections and government more accessible and transparent. Phil's various efforts in public service have been recognized and celebrated by everyone from Time magazine to Best Places to Work in Idaho, TEDx Boise, and even Food and Wine magazine, which featured his food truck voting concept. I am a little surprised that that one wasn't about his barbecue skills, which are competitive and well known. As Idaho's Secretary of State, Phil, a Republican, is responsible for running the state's elections, licensing businesses, trademarks, notaries, and other professions, and the maintenance and publication of official documents. He also maintains Idaho's will registry, provides an address confidentiality program for survivors of domestic violence, and produces Idaho's Blue Book and several other publications. He says his elections division works to ensure the accuracy and integrity of Idaho's elections, to ensure every voice is heard and every vote is counted properly. And its mission includes increasing transparency of campaign finances by simplifying the process of submitting and accessing disclosure reports. Yay! The Office of Secretary of State is established in the Idaho Constitution and serves a 4-year elected term. Please welcome Phil McGrain.
Thank you, Betsy.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you, Betsy, both for that very kind introduction, but as Controller Wolf mentioned too, I don't think all of us would be here if it wasn't for Betsy Russell and her dogged nature towards making sure government transparency is a priority for all of us. And I will agree, if you missed the last presentation, I encourage you to learn more about Transparent Idaho. I think Controller Wolf set a high bar, so hopefully I at least make it part of the way in terms of my presentation today. The topic for today is campaign finance and lobbying. It's Idaho's Sunshine Laws. It's talking about money and politics, which two things don't necessarily go much better together. It's like mac and cheese, right? Money and politics seem to be hand in hand. And so this is our part as a state, is to shed some light on the money that's in politics. It's part of why I wore my green tie today, just to reflect that this is the topic du jour. And so just to kind of kick things off, I just want to give a little bit of background to how we got to where we are. As I was doing a little research, some of this I knew beforehand, I was looking at just the history of campaign finance and campaign finance laws and how Idaho got to where our sunshine laws are today. But before I talk about that, one of my favorite things I stumbled on was one of the earliest recorded campaign finance violations, which, this is why I have my laptop up here, was attributed to George Washington. And no, it wasn't for not properly accounting for the cherry tree. It's even better because he was said to have purchased and distributed during the campaign more than a quart of rum, beer, or hard cider per voter. Certainly, voter turnout was higher when we were distributing rum, cider, and beer. I think bribes also helped in the past, but we're past that time. And so when you look at the history of the United States, the history of politics, we've seen it all. And that brings us to where we are today. It's really interesting. Idaho's sunshine laws fit so many of the states around the country. We aren't unique when it comes to this. Shortly after Watergate in the 1970s, in which there was undue influence and inappropriate spending and money in the Nixon campaign, all of a sudden there was a wave of efforts around the country to have citizens' initiatives to put in place sunshine laws. Right before that election, the Congress had actually created what is now the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, to regulate campaign finance. But it was really the events and the resignation of President Nixon that triggered a wave of efforts for sunshine. And that is true here in Idaho. Our sunshine laws, which are codified in Title 67, Chapter 66, are a reflection of a citizens' initiative. And while we've modified them a little bit over time, they still really are that original citizens' initiative that was circulated then. I think it's a testament to just the public and people engaged in the process wanting to have some oversight of their public officials. But it's also a reflection of sometimes the challenges an office like ours has in regulating this space, because sometimes it reads like a citizens' initiative and maybe doesn't have all the details worked out, or it's a reflection of the 1970s and we're dealing with campaign finance as it is today. And so I'm going to walk through what some of the basic rules are, how the campaign finance process works. But I think one of the biggest challenges of today, so each of you and respectively will have to bear with me, is we have a variety of audiences here. So everybody from local media to candidates who are looking to run for office, to people in my office testing my skills, and so many more. There's going to be a little bit for each of you in terms of what I present. So I'll go over at the beginning, and it'll probably be the drier part of my presentation, is just what are our campaign finance and lobbying laws, how do they work, but then I'll get into the fun part. For those of you who know me, and as Betsy kind of relayed, I'm a data junkie at heart, so I'll dive into the actual data tools on our website, and I'm proud to say that I'll be releasing today some brand new data tools that for the first time you guys will have access to look at some of the campaign finance data, particularly related to some of the local elections that are taking place right now. So, working with the citizens of Idaho in the 1970s, let's get a start. Idaho sunshine laws, the whole idea of sunshine is to say when there's money in politics is just like a river and a stream. You're never going to stop it. It will always find a path. So rather than trying to stop the flow, what we do is try to shed light on it and just expose what's happening so that voters can make informed choices. This is the stated purpose right now of our sunshine laws. The purpose of this chapter is to promote public confidence in government. I think, especially right now, and Brandon did an amazing job last time just talking about where the public's confidence is in their public officials. A lot of that is just this idea that there is money in politics or that people are being bought and influenced. In addition to shedding light, and I'll give some examples of this, on where money is going, sometimes it's equally important to shed light on what's not happening. One of my favorite examples when I've presented to the legislature in the past was Senator Jeff Sidaway. He's no longer in the legislature, but he served a long tenure in the Idaho legislature, and he never once accepted a campaign contribution. And people didn't know that. As a chairman, he was often, people would imply that he was being bought and sold by various lobbying groups or others, but it just never happened. And sharing that kind of information is important to the goal of promoting public confidence. In addition to public confidence, the other stated goal is to promote openness in government, very fitting for IDOG here today, and to promote transparency by those giving financial support to election campaigns and those promoting or opposing legislation or attempting to influence the executive or administrative actions for compensation. And this is, at its core, both donors who are involved in campaigns, but also lobbyists who spend their winters here in the hallways trying to have sway on what policy is being made here in the state of Idaho. Now, I'm going to get into the basics. And overall, in terms of campaign finance, it really is pretty simple at its core. It's just the details, for the candidates who are watching that matter. All money that is raised or spent in the state needs to be accounted for and reported. One of the things that's different between campaign finance and lobbying, campaign finance, true, is a literal accounting of all the money that is brought in by a candidate or a political committee and what is spent. So every dime in and every dime out needs to be accounted for so that the public has the ability to see what's going on throughout the campaign process. Now, just to get into the weeds a little bit, one of the big changes that we did as a state, I believe it was in the summer of 2018 that we started working on some campaign finance reforms, and one of them was to create a centralized database for all campaign finance reporting in the state of Idaho. That database is managed by the Idaho Secretary of State's office and my dedicated team. For any of you who ever need help on campaign finance, Cheryl Millard is our campaign finance manager, and she eats and breathes this stuff. She's very happy to help walk people through the phone, to navigate the system, to make sure that this process is easy. As an office, our first goal when it comes to campaign finance is to make it easy to comply. The best way to have sunshine is to make it easy for all those who are using it. Well before we talk about enforcement or anything else, we just want to make it easy to access. Surprisingly, before we had the centralized database, there were actually 29 different entities in the state of Idaho where campaign finance reports used to be filed. So anyone who wanted to see the influence of politics in Idaho had to go to 25 different locations, including that meant driving to St. Mary's because they didn't have a website and weren't posting it online at that time. Now it is available to everyone here through the Idaho Secretary of State's website. And so this doesn't just apply to statewide officials, it also applies down to our local officials. So for example, I'll talk about in a little bit, we have school trustee elections that are coming up here in November. If you want to see who's contributing to some of your trustee candidates, you can visit our Sunshine page and delve further into that information. In terms of how the overall process works, it still is a distributed process throughout the state. So the Secretary of State's office, as the chief election official, oversees all state, legislative, and judicial campaigns. And that's the financing that we're monitoring. So we have a regulatory responsibility in that space. The county clerks throughout the state also have access to the exact same database and are working in it with Cheryl, and we have all the county folks who are behind the scenes. The county clerks are the ones who oversee all of the local candidates. So county candidates, city candidates, the school trustees, even your cemetery district commissioner, if they get so excited to start raising money and putting up billboards. So you can see there. One thing I want to note is this is different. Today we're talking about Idaho Sunshine laws and where we regulate the space. On a federal level, so for example, for our United States senators and United States representatives, they report to the Federal Election Commission in Washington, D.C., which has both also promotes sunshine in campaign finance, but you can go visit the FEC for more information about the federal campaigns. The QR code here and also the website, this will take you to where the campaign finance portal lies. And I'll dive into it in a little bit. Now, just to get some of the basics out of the way so everyone knows where we're starting. The first and foremost is just when does someone become a candidate and when do they have to start reporting? This is the key. Every candidate has to have an appointed treasurer. Now, mind you, candidates can appoint themselves as treasurer, but once they start raising or spending money, they need to start reporting. So here are the criteria of when someone becomes a candidate. When announced the individual's candidacy publicly. I think this is probably one of the biggest things that trips people up who are running for office, is once you start gathering your friends together to have a rally and start telling everybody, hey, I'm going to be your next mayor, that means you have all of a sudden a reporting obligation. Even if you haven't raised or spent a thing. You have now declared your candidacy, and even if you aren't raising and spending money, the public has an interest in knowing what you're up to. Furthermore, it's once you filed for public office, I think this is interesting for local offices. It's actually more common that the first time there's any filing is when they actually file for office. But for like our legislative races, our statewide races, and others, usually those campaigns are beginning well in advance of the actual filing deadlines. And so one of the disconnects is someone will say, well, I haven't actually filed to run yet, so I shouldn't have to report anything. And in fact, that's not the case. Candidates often have campaign finance obligations well in advance of them actually officially formally filing to run for office. And so there's reporting requirements that come ahead. And I'll share some timeline examples of where you can see that activity in advance. Additionally, if anyone receives a pledge or contribution of money, so you just say, I've decided I'm going to run for the legislature, and your mom gives you $5, that $5 is now required to be reported and accounted for. And you need to list your mom as the donor. And so this is just where it all begins. Similarly, if you start spending money, and I'll actually say this is where we see a lot of candidates get tripped up, is as soon as any money is spent, that means the campaign has begun and there is reporting. So even though, and we see this more and more common nowadays, a candidate hasn't publicly announced, nobody really knows, maybe it's just within the family that they're thinking about doing this, but they want to have a really big splash when they kick it off, so they go buy their domain name, right? Right away, purchasing that domain name with their own funds triggers campaign finance reporting. Or just similarly, like buying yard signs and having them printed and ready to go, that triggers campaign finance reporting. So I encourage anyone who's looking at running for office in the future, one of the first places to start is just learning about what are the campaign finance reporting requirements. It's often easiest just as an administrative task to appoint a treasurer, even if you're appointing yourself or your spouse or a buddy, because those are the ones we see most often. But just getting that initial recording of appointing your treasurer to kick things off, to get going your campaign. We've had some significant instances of campaign finance violations in the past. Just as an example, when Tom Yalquist decided to run for governor, he didn't need to raise a bunch of money at that point. He had plenty of his own, and so he actually started investing in his campaign. Well, the Secretary of State's office came and followed up to say, no, that's a violation to spend that kind of money in advance, even though it's your own. And often people get confused. The public has an interest to know that, say, a billionaire is going to self-fund their campaign just as much as they have an interest in knowing a billionaire is funding somebody else's campaign. All right. I think this is one of the other aspects is, I mentioned this earlier, but all money raised and all money spent must be tracked. So if you've decided to run for office, often the simplest way is just have an Excel spreadsheet and make sure you're tracking all the money coming in, who gave it to you, and all the money spent. So that includes, like, when you are traveling the state, which I did quite a bit over the past couple of years. When I stop at a gas station, I have to report that I bought gas with my campaign funds as part of my travel. There are no anonymous contributions or expenses. And I want to emphasize this because this is often what tricks up people the most, is we all have this idea of passing around the hat, right? We've been to, like, say, some nonprofit event or at church and someone's passed around the hat to raise some money. We have a big room of people. They're all full of people who want to support. And so just to raise some money, we pass the hat. There is no passing the hat in Idaho politics. You must know where every dollar came from, right? Including a dollar. So if you were to go pull up my campaign finance report, there was one guy who mailed me a single dollar bill. I'm pretty sure I spent more on my thank you note, but still it's important that that gets reported. Any money. Now, one of the key things is, let's say someone does give you $5. You don't actually have to itemize and report that individual's name at that point in time. When we itemize, that's reporting the person's name and address who contributed. That happens after they have contributed more than $50. Now, a candidate may voluntarily choose to list all of their donors regardless of the amount, but it's not until over $50 that a candidate is required to report that contribution and list the person's name. And sometimes we see people who don't want to be listed, so they only contribute, say, $25 to a campaign. The thing is, though, as a candidate, so for those of you who are running or looking, you still have to know who gave you that $5 and know their information. And it's important because they may have only given you $5 today, but next week they decided they changed their mind and they give you $50. So now they've given you a total of $55. You are now required to report that information. It's cumulative. It's not each individual contribution. If that was the case, I'm sure there's plenty of donors who would just write 50 different checks with the amount of money. Instead, it's you as a candidate are responsible for keeping track of that, and the county clerks and the Secretary of State's office have the authority to ask for your financial records to show where any of that unitemized money came from. If for some reason someone gets an anonymous donation, so you show up home one night and there's an envelope full of cash on your doorstep, and yes, I've heard of this happening before, you don't know where it came from. You have two choices. Figure out where it came from so that you can keep it and report it, or in law, it requires you to give that money to Controller Wolf, right? Brandon is ready and willing to accept so that it can be deposited in the Idaho School Fund. So anonymously is required to be turned over to the state controller's office and put in the Idaho School Fund. Similarly, expenditures, all expenditures must be tracked as well. There are no anonymous spending. So, often I actually will advise that candidates use, for example, like a debit card for their spending. In campaigns, I will say cash is the most dangerous because cash is the hardest to track. So whether you're keeping track using checks, keeping track using a debit card, you want to be able to look back. Because usually when you're hopping between events or other things are going on, it's easy to lose sight of those things that you purchase. But keep those receipts and just keep track of your spending. But as soon as someone gives you cash, record it and get it into the bank as quickly as possible. Similarly, when you're spending money, try to make sure you keep track of everything. Itemization is at $25. So anything less than that, if you're paying for parking, it doesn't have to be itemized. But these are just kind of the basics of some of the. Now, there's one caveat to what I just listed, and because we're in an off year right now and we've got a bunch of local elections coming up, so we've got mayoral elections, city council elections, school trustees, a list of others, local candidates don't fall under the same rules that the state legislative judicial candidates do. There's an exemption, so local candidates, because we have many rural parts of Idaho where it's hard enough to get somebody to run, let alone any money being spent on the races, there's a $500 threshold. For local candidates only, until they raise or spend $500, there is no reporting requirement. By default, their appointment of a political treasurer when they file for office, it just automatically appoints them as their political treasurer when they file. But again, those local candidates need to keep track of any money they spend. So if you're a local candidate, you're just planning to put out a handful of yard signs, you still need to keep track that you spent money on those yard signs, because as soon as you do hit that $500 threshold, you are then required to start reporting, including reporting the original $500 that you spent. You go backwards and report all of that activity, so again, that the public can see what's taking place. So it's a little bit of a caveat. What we often see, and actually this means in many cases through parts of the state, lots of parts of the state don't see any reporting because there just isn't enough activity. Someone can put up a website, someone can buy some yard signs well with under the $500 threshold, but when you start to see a really active campaign, then it triggers the reporting requirements. I will add, this was specifically added because it used to be just different thresholds depending on the office, or many offices didn't have reporting requirements. But in parts of the state, like here in Boise, we're seeing really, really expensive school trustee elections these days. Real money is coming in all sorts of parts of the process, and as a state, it's a priority for us to shed light on where that money is going. All right, donation limits. We get these questions all the time in the office, is like, how much money can you give? I think one of the really interesting things about Idaho is that we have limits, and I personally am thankful for that. I was recently meeting with a bunch of other secretaries of state, and it was fascinating to hear how the laws differ between the states. There's a lot of states that have no limits. It's really interesting. I'll talk about lobbying in a little bit, but if we look just to our neighbor to the west, Oregon has really, really, really strict lobbying requirements. I'll talk about lobbying here in a little bit. You can't buy a legislator a cup of coffee, but the legislator can ask for $100,000. It makes no sense to me. In Idaho, lobbyists can buy a cup of coffee, but legislators cannot ask for $100,000. For statewide campaigns, the maximum contribution is $5,000. For legislative campaigns, county campaigns, city campaigns, judicial campaigns, everything that is not statewide, the maximum contribution is $1,000. These limits are per individual, per business, or political committee, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Businesses can sharing controlling interest. So, for example, because especially with city elections coming up, developers usually have hundreds of LLCs. That doesn't mean they can give $1,000 100 different times. They are restricted to giving $1,000 maximum from their businesses. So they can divide it, they can get it from one business or another, but it is all limited in terms of the maximum contribution. Any contribution of $1,000 or more, so this is a maximum contribution to a local race or a legislative race, or if you're at a statewide level, it's still the same $1,000 threshold, must be reported within 48 hours. So that's going on to our website. If you actually look right now, and once I show some of the tools here in a little bit, and you were to look up, say, the legislature, because this is an off year, their reporting is only going to show $1,000 contributions. It's going to show a whole bunch of $1,000 contributions, and that's because the reporting requirements are only in the election year. I'll talk about these deadlines a little bit here in a second. But so what you're seeing is all these 48-hour reports, because the 48-hour requirement is all the time. So even though I'm not up for election until 2026, if I get a contribution today for $1,000, within the next 48 hours, I have an obligation to go onto the site and report it publicly so that people can see what's happening. This also, all these limits also apply to in-kind campaign contributions. For those who aren't familiar, an in-kind contribution is, instead of cash or a financial donation, it's giving some good or service that's of the equivalent value, right? So let's just say you own a billboard and you're saying, hey, friend, you can put your sign up on my billboard. If that billboard has market value and normally you would be using it commercially, you have to for example, if one of your friends wants to host a fundraiser in their home and bring some of their friends and neighbors over to see you, and they decide to buy hors d'oeuvres, food and drinks, or George Washington shows up with more than a quart of rum and beer, then you need to report the value of that rum and beer that they purchased and where they purchased it from. So you actually need them to keep their receipts so that you can say, oh yeah, Susie hosted an event. She went to Costco, bought a platter for $75. George Washington showed up and spent $500 on booze, right? Like, all of that has to be reported. So either way, one of the things I'll note, especially for candidates who are particularly active, sometimes if you're hosting a large event with many people, it's actually better for the campaign to pay and absorb the cost of hosting the event, because it's not that difficult to exceed the campaign finance limits. If someone's going to a local, one of the event venues here in downtown Boise, just reserving the space may cost $500. You buy $700 worth of food and drinks, you've actually exceeded the campaign finance limits. Your donors can't give more than $1,000, whether that's in food and event space or whether it's cash. But you as a campaign can spend whatever amount on that event. They can give you $1,000, other people can give you money, and you can still cover the costs. So just a simple thing that people get tripped up on. Just to highlight this really clearly, this is the simple version. We get asked this all the time, like, well, what's the maximum I can contribute? Because there are some people who are really passionate, or you have a successful friend who really wants to help your campaign. The limits that apply are per individual. So usually you have the donor. It could be then the donor's spouse, because each individual has a right to make a contribution, and then the business. Let's just say my hypothetical couple here also happen to own a business. Collectively, they can give $3,000 to a legislative campaign. Or if this were a statewide campaign, they could give $15,000, $5,000 from each. Again, I already kind of mentioned this, but the business, doesn't matter how many businesses they own. If they own 10 businesses, there's still a maximum of one contribution for the collective businesses that they have ownership and control of. And so that's important. It didn't always used to be this case in the state of Idaho, but around, I think it was the early 2000s, there were some contributions that exceeded well over $50,000 that had huge influence. And so the legislature said, oops, we want to put a cap on this. It shouldn't be that only the wealthy can influence. Like, it's trying to level the playing field to a certain degree. I will note that we don't see a lot of activity. It's only on the very largest races does this become a problem. For example, like the governor's race, where there's a lot of people interested in contributing up to the maximum. But legislators, especially like legislative leadership, you'll see larger contributions of this nature. In terms of filing, the filing scheme that we have now, scheme sounds like the wrong word, but it fits here, is it's monthly reporting in the year of the election. So on the 10th of every month, the candidates or political committees involved in an upcoming election must report by the 10th of every month the activity of the prior month. And so if the campaign started in February, from February on monthly, all the way through the end of the year, there is monthly reporting requirement. So for example, because this is an odd number year, it's all the local races that have monthly reporting requirements. So a really easy example, because I'll talk about it more, is like Mayor McLean. Mayor McLean has had to report monthly throughout the entire year because she has an active campaign. She had an active campaign before. It's worth noting, because I don't have it on a slide, that a candidate is presumed, an office holder, like myself, is presumed to be a candidate all the way up until I don't file for re-election. I can't exempt myself out while I hold office. I'm always a candidate, always have reporting requirements until we actually get to the deadline and I've actively not chosen to run and file for re-election. But that monthly reporting is in the year of the election. So for example, legislators are up for re-election next year. So right now, the only requirement they have for this year is that 48-hour reporting that I mentioned, or they will have an annual report due on the 10th of January next year, which will just report all of that below $1,000 activity will get reported at the beginning of the year, and then that will trigger from then on next year. They will have monthly reporting requirements all the way through the primary and through the general election. They will report monthly. And so same thing for many local offices. So school trustees are a really good example right now. Most people didn't know they were going to run for school trustee until about a month ago. You know, when they decided to file in August, that's what triggered them to start. If they hit the $500 threshold, they now need to report monthly through the remainder of the year what their campaign finances are. In terms of that reporting, there is a 48-hour grace period. But if you miss that 48-hour grace period, there is a $50 a day penalty for missing that, right? And our system tracks that activity. Because this comes up all the time, any material that is electioneering communication, so any, vote for me, so whether that's a billboard, a TV ad, a radio ad, a postcard, a palm card, should have a disclaimer saying paid for by. So paid for by the candidate. As you see here, our Yosemite Sam example, paid for by Yosemite Sam for governor, Elmer Fudd treasurer. That's the preferred way. Most notably, what the law states is that it requires that it's clear who paid for it. And that's important too, because you would say, well, of course, it's Yosemite Sam who paid for this, right? But that actually isn't. Just seeing the sign is not clear enough, because it's very possible, for example, a political committee will also send out material on behalf of a candidate that the candidate is unaware of. And so it's important to know, was this paid for by the campaign and the candidate, or was this paid for by a political committee? Either way, we need to be able to see it, and the public has a right to know, so that they get a flyer in the mail. And I've had constituents. We were in Malad for Capitol for a day, and a constituent brought in a piece of mail that he got, and he wanted to know who's behind this. It's like, oh, well, look up this, and you can go see who are the donors contributing to that group that sent you that piece of mail. Right? That's the purpose of shedding light on all of this. All right, so political committees. I've mostly been, up to this point, really talking about candidates. Some of the rules apply the same, the reporting timeline. So in the year of an election, a political committee is active. They have a monthly reporting requirement. Political committees are different than candidates. Candidate is choosing to run for office. They're the one going. Political committee is an organization of people. It could be what we call a special interest group. So it could be a group of like-minded people, say sportsmen, for example. It could be an industry. So it could be like realtors who want to gather together. It could be all sorts of things. And we see a wide variety of political committees. It's a group of people who've gathered that want to pool resources to either support or oppose a candidate or a measure. So this includes like initiatives and referendums, constitutional amendments. The political committees must, just like a candidate, report all the money that comes in and all the money that goes out. They have the same reporting requirement. Now, they don't have to report all the money that let's say it's an organization that does other things, just normal nonprofit activity. This is specifically the money that they are receiving and spending for the purposes of influencing politics, right? So again, supporting or opposing a candidate or a measure. One thing that is different for political committees, and this comes from the United States Supreme Court with Citizens United, is there are no campaign finance limits. So somebody has $1 million that they really want to spend on campaigns, they can put $1 million, one individual, into a political committee, and that's totally acceptable. And yes, we do see that kind of activity. Not a lot of it here in Idaho, but we do see very large contributions nationally, and we're seeing more money nationally come into our politics, just spent everywhere, as you do see large contributions. The infamous super PACs. Now, in our law, it's referred to as a political committee, but if you've ever heard the term PAC, Political Action Committee, it's synonymous. I'm talking about the same thing. The one thing about political committees is so they may contribute to a candidate's campaign, but that contribution is subject to the campaign finance limits I discussed before. So political, again, individual person puts $1 million in their political committee, they want to support a candidate, they can go ahead and give a $1,000 contribution to a legislative candidate. But they're capped, just the same as everybody else, with that contribution. Similarly, they're capped with an in-kind contribution. So say they want to work with the candidate and do something together, they can only give up to the limitation. Now here's the real caveat. Most of the activity that you see from PACs, and this is part of the law, is uncoordinated. It's independent. If a political committee acts independently of a candidate, they can spend whatever they want to support that candidate. So a political committee can spend $100,000 on TV ads promoting a candidate. The crucial point is that political committee is not allowed to work with the candidate. The candidate has no knowledge of this, right? And this is a really confusing part. Both, it's tough for us to make sure to police that space, to make sure that it is separate, but it's also tough for the public to understand. I can just tell you from my own personal story, I did a radio interview in the Magic Valley, and a radio ad during one of the breaks of my interview played, and it was a radio ad about me. And I had never heard of it. I was unfamiliar with it. And the host wanted to ask me questions like, this is my first time hearing it, just like it is theirs. But I had no part in it. And that's actually how it's supposed to work, is that the candidates have no involvement in that. And we do see some very active political committees who are hyper engaged and often may have more professional staff than the candidates will themselves in terms of promotion of candidacy. I think one of the things that we've seen over time is, in some ways, less money going directly to candidates and more money going into political committees that go out and just do the work on behalf of candidates. The same reporting schedule as I mentioned, elections. This is important for anybody who's involved in a political committee. Most political committees we see are really active during the even-numbered years. So when the legislature is up or the governor's office is up, those statewide campaigns. But there are some political committees that engage both in state races and in local races. If a political committee is only engaged in state races, they have to report monthly during those even-numbered years. But if that same political committee gets engaged in a local race, say like the upcoming mayor's race, then they have a monthly reporting requirement just as the local candidates do in that year that they're engaged. So it just depends on when they're getting involved in the process, depending on whether they have monthly or annual reporting requirements. And then finally, I just want to note the IRS designation of an organization is irrelevant to Idaho campaign finance laws. This is always a top topic, so probably some of you have been involved in conversations. Well, is this a 501c4, a 501c6, a 501c3, or is this like a 547? Whatever the organization's number is for the IRS, we don't care. This has already been taken up in court here in Idaho. It does not provide any protections. A nonprofit, there are political activity requirements relevant to the IRS and what code they have as they're regulated by the IRS for tax reporting purposes, but that's different than the campaign finance requirements. A 501c3 that spends money on a political campaign, as soon as you start spending money in terms of supporting or opposing any candidate or measure, it now has to be reported. All right, I would save this part to the end, so fines. Philosophically, my approach as Secretary of State, and we're doing a lot in the office right now, is to improve the campaign finance process. Is our first goal is, as I mentioned before, is to make it easy to comply. Usually that's the hardest piece. What we actually see is not people trying to break the law. We often just see candidates who are confused, don't understand the law, or don't know the steps. And often, as I already mentioned, many candidates' political treasurer is their spouse, right? They're not necessarily experts in accounting or finance. And so we want to try and make sure it's as easy as possible to comply so that they know what they need to keep track of and what they need to spend, and what they need to track of and what they need to report. After we have compliance, and I'll share this here in a minute, our goal is to just shed light on it, to just share the information, make it transparent so that all of you can see. Often the greatest regulators in campaign finance are the opponents. Everyone's watching each other's money, and they are really quick to point out other people's flaws. We don't even have to take that active role because somebody is doing it for us. Or we see more and more in the election space, people who are eager to get in and watch that. Finally, it's to actually, the goal of our laws is to shed light on the process, not to penalize people. This isn't a hammer that's designed to make or break anybody's campaign. What it is trying to get compliance. And so you can see The $50 late for reporting, the $250 fine for candidate, up to a $250 fine for candidates, and up to a $2,500 fine for political committees. And then I already mentioned unaccounted contributions can be donated to Brandon and put in the school fund. Now, Ben Usursa, one of my predecessors, used to always say, just as a reminder, no one has ever gotten into trouble for over-reporting. It's much better to report than it is to not report. So when in doubt, report. All right, I'm going to cruise through here because I want to get to the fun stuff. I'm trying to be mindful of the clock. Lobbyists. So one of the interesting distinctions. So our sunshine laws cover both campaign finance and lobbying, kind of interwoven together. Lobbyists are those people who are receiving compensation to influence public policy here in the state, so influencing our legislators. So if you're being paid to do it, doesn't mean that's how you make a living. It could just be a side hobby, but you're being paid to influence the executive branch or legislative branch. You have an obligation to report. Or also, if you're spending money to influence, so you may not be being paid, but you are spending money to entertain or build a relationship with legislators, you have an obligation to report. But it really is just who's influencing us. And this is because the public has an interest. If an interest group is encouraging a some legislation, they have a right to know who's behind that. I've already kind of covered who must report. Who does not need to report? So not everyone's covered under this. So the news media does not have to register as a lobbyist. Those who are not compensated or receive less than $250 in a calendar year for lobbying, so someone who's just coming in. Members of a trade association or business with a designated lobbyist. So I'll give you, this is a really good caveat just to highlight here. Let's say you're a realtor and the realtors have a registered lobbyist who's actively down here. You come as a member to testify and support. That member does not have to register as a lobbyist. They have the registered lobbyist representing their organization who has the reporting requirements. The same thing goes for businesses. So businesses will have a designated registered lobbyist who must report on all the activity of members of the business. Rather than having every employee, say at Micron, register, not that they're all going to be down here, you just have the main person who's registered. And then also local elected officials and state officers, so like department heads of the state, do not have to register as lobbyists. There's a presumption that as state officials, they are engaged in the legislative process. Registering as a lobbyist is fairly easy. It's $10 to register. It's $10 per whoever you represent. So some lobbyists represent numerous groups or individuals. They have to register for each one respectively. It's done on our website. And registration needs to occur before someone actively starts lobbying. That's always an important reminder. Or within 30 days of being designated. So before, the 30 days would be like, say right now, someone says, hey, I want to hire you as a lobbyist. You need to register now, even though you may not lobby until next January, when you get going. Lobbying is different than campaign finance. As I mentioned, campaign finance is a literal accounting of the information. Lobbying, we don't track any of the money that comes in. We don't know what lobbyists make. We don't know how much their clients are paying. We only know the amount of money that they're actually spending on influencing government officials. So they have to report anytime they, go buy a cup of coffee for somebody or host an event. That's when the reporting requirement is when money is being spent influencing those legislators. In terms of spending, if it's a cup of coffee, they just report it as a general expense in terms of the reporting. It only has to be itemized when an expense exceeds $130. And that was set by that is set combination by our office and the legislature. We have a increment from 2012 that we have to keep up with inflation, but it's a statutory set limit that keeps rising. Reporting deadlines. Lobbyists have to report. This is kind of relevant right now. Lobbyists have to report on the 15th of the month following the month that they were lobbying in, anytime the legislature is in session. So right now, there is no reporting requirement, but hypothetically, if, let's say, in the next week, the legislature were to come convene for a special legislative session, all lobbyists registered in the state would all of a sudden have to report for the month. Even if they weren't engaged in that topic, whenever the legislature comes in, so does lobbying reporting requirements as well. This became a really big topic last year about this time when there was special legislative session, because a whole bunch of lobbyists got fined for not remembering to report. And so we want to make sure everyone knows. And then there are also annual reports due. So for most of the year where it's not very active, and let's say a lobbyist, during the summer months takes a legislator out to golf, they will report that golf experience on their annual report when it comes up. In addition, most lobbyists are known to be lobbying the legislature, but there are also lobbyists lobbying the executive branch and executive officials, specifically like the governor's office. If someone is dedicated to just lobbying the executive branch, they have both an annual and semi-annual report to file. But if they're lobbying the legislature or the legislature and the executive branch, it's just when the legislature is in session in that annual report. All right, let's get to the fun stuff, because this is more exciting. Now, one of the things, and I meant to mention it earlier, this campaign finance and lobbying reporting has been one of my highest priorities coming into office. During the last legislative session, I asked for funding to revamp and improve our reporting tools, both to make it easy for users to comply, but also to make some of the data more accessible. For those of you who know me, I'm a data junkie, and I want to share more and more information when it comes to this space. So our office is actually very actively working in replacing the systems that we have. There are pain points as I share some of the presentation, things that will be changing on our website. Our goal is to be launching a new system by January, leading into the next legislative session as well as into the next campaign year. And so I'll give you both how it's working right now, especially for the local candidates who are using the current tools and people who are watching what's happening locally, but I'll also give you at least a taste of where we're headed in terms of some of the tools that will be available in the future. So let's go to some sunshine. Let's see. Oh, there we go. All right. There's my ugly mug. Welcome to the Idaho Secretary of State's website. Because of the topic we're talking about, all talks about elections, elected officials. It can all be found within our elections division. You can see here. We have our campaign finance portal. There's both the campaign finance portal for candidates, and I'll talk about that very briefly, as well as the public tool, which we call our Sunshine tool. And then also you can see down below here lobbyist information. I'm going to focus on campaign finance first because I think it's the sexier topic at the moment. But just because I know there are some candidates watching locally, here is our main campaign finance page. It has a number of resources, including frequently asked questions that come up for candidates. It has old reporting information, even tax information for political organizations. There's a lot of additional information here. But the main thing is, here's the campaign finance portal login. And hopefully I stayed logged into this. I'm going to skip over because here we go. Yes. Darn it. Will it allow me? I was going to show you behind the scenes of my own campaign finance tool, but I don't know if that's going to work. All right. Any candidate who needs assistance on the back end, I encourage them to contact our office because I know, looking around, most of the audience is not a candidate, but this is our campaign finance portal. This is the page and where candidates go in and enter that information, all of their contributions as well as their expenditures. Our office is happy to walk anybody through this process. This same thing for political organizations. One of the things for local candidates that we're working to improve with the new tool that we launch is we're trying to make it so that you can actually just keep your accounting as a candidate in our system. Rather than having to have an Excel spreadsheet or something else, you'll have your version where you can keep all that information available and pull your own reports that you might need. But then when you need to, you could hit submit and send it to our office so that we can make it publicly available. There's not a lot of interesting stuff to share, but all of this information that is reported by the candidates, so let's say, for example, a 48-hour report, they enter it, this gets shared to our website through our current tool, Sunshine. So at sunshine.sos.idaho.gov, it can also, this is that campaign finance public portal on the drop-down menu that I mentioned. Here is our current tool. This is the aggregate of all of that campaign finance data that's available to the public. So you're interested in who's spending money and what's happening or who's raising money right now, or often this gives you some of that first initial insight into who's considering running for what, right? Because you'll see challengers, as I mentioned before, they have an obligation to start reporting their campaign finance and appoint a treasurer. So for legislative races, we already have a preview of some of the people interested in running through looking at their campaign finance reporting. The power of this tool, this is a powerful tool in terms of the information, but I know for many it can also be a little bit overwhelming. I'm going to share some of the simplest secrets when coming here. So this right here, so we see Debbie has just filed her first $500 report. So here she's a candidate running for Blackfoot City Council. So she just finally decided she's either spent or raised $500. This is just a running list. So every 4 hours, this list gets updated based on the reporting that occurs. There's nothing special about why Debbie is at the top, other than she was the most recent person to file a report. But you can use these filters both along the side and at the top to gain some of the information. So as I mentioned right now, it is the aggregate. So you can kind of see these highlights up here. 67,000 donors have given $55 million. That's a lot of money in Idaho politics. Surprisingly, that $55 million is only dating back to 2020. We're not even going back that far. It just shows there's a lot of money. You can kind of see a summary up here in terms of the graph. How much the green is how much was raised. This is how much has been expended by candidates or PACs. I actually think so these tools right here get overlooked. These two buttons. This is often what I think people are looking for. There's just, if you click on that, you can see a different view and different charts. So these are the bar charts just showing who's raised the most money. Surprise, Brad Little. You can filter here so if we want to look beyond, say, the top 5, we can look at the top 25 and see who is on that list. I'm running way behind the governor. You can also filter this information so candidates and PACs. We can just do it here. We can also look at spending, right? Who's spending the most in terms of the money. So no surprise, people raising the most money spend most of the money. But it does change a little bit, the order of this. It's interesting too, this gives you some of those insights. Who were the big spenders, right, in the process? You can also see, an easy one that I think a lot of people pay attention to is where is the Idaho State Democratic Party? Where's the Idaho Republican Party? I know both parties talk about how much the other one is spending and raising, going back to what I was saying. We can also, as I mentioned, filter by, so let's just say vendors, like how much are we spending, right? Where's the money going? So I can tell you FB1 Strategies happens to be the consultants that the governor uses, hence why it's at the top, right? But you can kind of go through and see some of the different spending that is happening. And so this is without actually even getting into, a lot of people get a little overwhelmed by these filters on the side. Just playing around, clicking here with these simple things at the top often gets you where you want to start. So I'm going to switch back to candidates and go to donations. The real power, though, is over here. Again, one of the challenges with this tool is it's all of the information. So this has past races in it, going back to 2020. It has everything from the governor's race all the way down to, I don't know that there's any cemetery district commission races in here, but if they spent more than $500, there would be. Right, so local races, library trustee races, others are in this tool. But using this, you can filter, for example, the timeline. So let's just go, we're going to do some of the quick filters. So we'll look at the last 30 days. So I've hit the last 30 days. And we want to filter, what campaign we're going to look at. So I'm going to pick an easy one that we'll kind of talk about throughout the day. Let's go down to mayor. So we can select mayor here, and then within the districts, we can pick Boise City mayor's race, right? Because I think a lot of money's coming, and this is an easy one to highlight. So I'm just going to click search. So using these tools, it has now filtered all of that data, and we can look at, in the last 30 days, there's been 111 donors who've given $37,000 to 2 candidates. And the 2 candidates have spent $22,000 on 9 vendors. And again, just like earlier, so here's Mayor McLean, here's her challenger, Mike Masterson, and then this is the list of all the donations that they've received or the expenses that they've reported. I will say this is a little bit misleading at the moment, and explain why it's important to note on a bunch of the charts. Again, going back to that reporting schedule, because I selected the last 30 days, they've only had to report $1,000 contributions over the last 30 days. On October 10th, they will report all of their other activity for the month of September. And so this is only really showing the highest contributions. I can tell you both of them have raised more and spent more than what this is showing right now. It'll be when the next report comes up that we'll actually see a little bit more insight into it. But it's easy enough. We can always just, change our time period. So let's go back a little ways. I'm going to go back to January 1st. Do the same thing. Oh, and this is probably a little bit more accurate reflection of the campaign so far, right? So here you can see how much money was raised between the two candidates for the year. I will note Mayor McLean had raised money before January 1st, so this isn't a full reflection of her balance. But you can kind of see the information, or we can go back and, again, do the comparison, how much money raised versus money spent. The real power in this tool, though, is using these filters along the side. We've had even media ask us recently, and I've intentionally demonstrated this does include the local information. So if we want to focus, let's see what we're doing before. I'm going to change two of my filters. I'm going to go to City Council. I honestly don't know what we're going to get when I do this, but let's say we do City Council, and we do Blackfoot because we saw that Debbie just reported. All right, we'll filter the same thing. Well, Debbie hasn't, no one has contributed. I should have picked someone easier. Let's pick a different area. We're going to go to Eagle because I know there's activity in Eagle. Oh, come on. All right, I'm going to hit reset real quick. If I clear, so that button I just hit down below cleared all my filters. So we're going to go for the entire time. Let's see. I'm just going to change this. Go to contest. Council. Hill City. Right? What? I do not know why. Well, this is me highlighting why I want to change it. Is all this is doing. All right. I'm going to skip ahead because I have more fun stuff to share than that. I want to show real quickly on our website. So if we go back to the main page, we go back to Elections Division, Lobbyist Information. Just like on the campaign finance side, here is where you can see all the lobbyist information. This is also for any of you who are aspiring lobbyists. This is where you go register and pay your $10 to register as a lobbyist. On the left is the lobbyist portal login. So this is where lobbyists who are reporting will log in and report their information. On the right, the search. So this 2023 search, the last legislative session, is where we can see what has been reported by the lobbyists. So for those of you who are interested to see who's influencing our legislators and what, here's where you can see all the spending, what categories that spending in. No surprise, entertainment happens to be the highest one, so events and entertainment. This is the dinners, right, that are hosted throughout the session, and where the reporting is. I think for the public, so if you go down here, you can see what organizations are the biggest spenders, what lobbyists are the biggest spenders. There's the categories that the lobbyists have reported in terms of what that spending was on. But I will say, from my experience, the tools that are most helpful are these two right here. If you actually want to see, so if we click lobbyists, this will give us just a listing of all the registered lobbyists in the state. And so you can kind of go through and see who's registered for what. And if we go through, you'll see here on the right-hand side, it shows many lobbyists just represent one entity. But there are other contract lobbyist professionals who represent more than one, right? So we can go through here. And so I'm going to pick on Roger Batt, not because I'm actually picking on Roger Batt, but he's 10. If I click right next to his name, it will show who his clients are that he's representing. You You can see when he registered, contact client, but also you can see the links right here to the reports that Roger has filed. And this is true for all of the lobbyists. So you can see each of the monthly reports. And so I'm just going to give one example. And let's see. Yeah, Coalition for Agriculture Futures. Seems like a very Idaho thing. So I pull up his February report, and you can see he spent $81 on that organization. It'll also list what bills, for example, so this client on this lobbyist was interested in Senate Bill 1040 as well as Senate Bill 1062. I don't have any idea, but I'm guessing those are on this page. If you're like me and you're like, I don't know who these lobbyists are, why would I know what to look up the lobbyists? Instead of going to lobbyists, go to employers. And it's basically just flipping the script in terms of what you want to see. And so you're like, oh, that's what I wanted to see. I want to see what various organizations, just search a name of an organization. So I'll pick on our friends, Idaho Power. Right, so here we go. I just searched, found Idaho Power real quick. And from here we can see all of the lobbyists who are registered to represent Idaho Power, as well as any of the reports that are filed for Idaho Power. So we'll just pick on Nate Fisher, because I know he represents Idaho Power. Look at his February report. Now, this is an interesting one. So it shows 0 here, and I kind of referenced this earlier. The reason it shows 0 is because Nate Fisher is not actually the primary lobbyist for the organization. This goes into how each person doesn't have to report. We don't have to report multiple times. Instead, I'm going to scroll down and click on Jeff Malman. Jeff Malman is Nate Fisher Jr.'s boss. And here we see the money that Idaho Power spent in the month of February in terms of lobbying. Right? And so this just to help people who aren't familiar with this tool on how to navigate it. Now, skipping towards the fun stuff. All right, I mentioned I was going to give you a taste before I take questions, and I can geek out here for a little while. This is a brand new web page for our office. So it's actually, there's no links if you go to navigate to our office. You might as well jot this down if you want. It's sos.idaho.gov/dashboards. This will be where we're going to start building out some of our data visualization. Many of you are familiar with me in data visualization, the work of Anthony Locksmith at Ada County. We've worked together for years. I'm happy to report that I've got Gabe Osterhout, who deserves all the credit for this. So thank you, Gabe, for being our data viz guy in the office. He's the one who's helping try to make election and campaign finance and lobbyist information accessible to the public. So this is really kind of a foray into where we're trying to go with everything. But I will say you have access to this information now. As I'm going through it, you can pull it up on your computer and you can be clicking around as well. We have 2 visualizations that we've built, one on campaign finance and one on lobbying, just to fit the topic for the day. So I'm going to delve in here a little bit to some of our new tools. And hopefully this is making some of this information a bit more accessible for you as the public. So I should have, well, let me, for those that aren't very familiar with Tableau and Tableau visualizations, I'm just going to show you, by clicking in this little icon in the bottom corner, this is just making it full screen so that we can all see it real easily as I navigate. This is the same information that is available through the Sunshine page. And actually, I'm going to skip back real quick to the Sunshine page. Where is it? Here we go. Oh yeah, the page that annoyed me last time I was here. One of the things I forgot to mention, for those of you who are nerds who are watching like me, an important thing to note is this download button. All of the information that we make publicly available, and not only can you go search and filter it, if you want to and you want to geek out on your own, you can download the information. Also, if you filter it, so like my example when I had the Boise Mayor's race, if I only want to look at the Boise Mayor's race, once I've filtered it, I can hit download and it will download all the transactions for that, for what's being displayed, so that you can build your own tool. And back to Gabe's dashboard. Here, so what this is we intentionally focused, knowing that the city elections are coming up, the local elections, we have focused on the city elections throughout the state so we can share it, because often people have the hardest time filtering through everything that's on the Sunshine page to find what they're looking for the upcoming November election. So this dashboard is specifically focused on mayor and city council races around the state. As you'll see, in terms of the candidates listed on the left, mayors are colored in blue. The city council members are colored in gold. And so you can kind of see who's raised the most. Surprise, Mayor McLean has raised the most money. The other part, and I think this is fascinating, is our map here. I'm going to hit home just to reset our map. These dots and the size of the dots, there's a dot for any city in which there was a contribution. Who would have known so many people around the United States were interested in mayor and city council races here in Idaho? So this represents the entire state, all the various candidates right now in terms of it, including, this is my favorite, there's dots up here in Alaska, right? So Palmer, Alaska is interested in Idaho city elections. So is Moulton, Alabama, right? And the size of the dot, so if you're really interested in focusing, I'm picking the little ones, but there's a little bit more money over here in Virginia. A couple of cool things when you get to play with it. First and foremost is this little hamburger icon is a filter. So if you open this up, it will let you sort the data. A key thing right now is this is mayor and city council races. This isn't just the upcoming election. This also includes the last city council cycle. So if we were to look at it, 2 years ago, there were also city council members running. And so this will have both of it. And let's say we just want to filter because we want to focus on what's coming up. I'm going to take out 2020 and 2021 and just focus on the most recent donations. I can also choose just to focus on, say, mayor or city council. I can search for a particular candidate. And maybe just as importantly, I can choose to zoom in on a particular area. So since I failed earlier, we'll stick with Eagle now. All right, so here we go. This is the money raised for the City of Eagle race. All right, so you can see all the money reported for the City of Eagle. Here's each of the candidates. Here's the map, not nearly as exciting as I was just showing you before. Arizona has a small interest in the City of Eagle. It shows you just how many cities, how many states. Here's all the people. Now, if we want to, we can click on a particular candidate and filter this information. So anytime you highlight something on this visualization, it will zoom in. I'm guessing this is actually the candidate's own money. We'll talk about that here in a second. I'm going to switch, though, more because there's more data to play with in the City of Boise. So here's the City of Boise. This is just the City of Boise when you get to see all the dots on the map, right? There are a lot of people who are interested in Boise politics. So we can look all around, highlighting on here. If you want to, there's a filter right here to zoom in just to see where is money coming in the state of Idaho. We can just zoom in to see here. And there's a couple of other tools that I want to highlight. So one, actually, let me go back to this because it's fun, and I want people to have fun with this data. If you want to, you can just click along the way and filter, and so each candidate you can pick and see, oh, there's Mayor McLean's dots. Here's Mike Masterson's dots. And we'll go down and Jimmy Halliburton's dots, right? So you can just get to play around and see the different things and highlight over where it is. That we do have individual transaction data. So, let's go back to Jimmy's because it's an easier one. This button down here below will actually open up the reports for that candidate, for whatever you've highlighted. So you can go through and see the actual donations that the candidate has received. And if you're really nerdy, you can click on that and view the actual campaign finance report for that person. Beyond that, let's unhighlight Jimmy for a second. If we select, so these are tabs up here to show you other visualizations of the same information. So I'm going to click on timeline, remove the map. You can actually see where the money is coming in. Right now, it's just broken up by the blue line represents the money in the mayor's race. The gold line represents the money in the city council races. And you can kind of see over time when that money is coming in. You can also switch it and just look at the candidates. So Each candidate now has a line. If I hover over any of these, it'll show me who it is. So like there's Mayor McLean, when the money's coming in. I will note that all these drop off here at the very end, again, because the September report hasn't been submitted yet. Only that $1,000 not money has been in. And then finally, I'm going to highlight, so remove the timeline, is you can go to contributors. So each of these boxes are a contributor. I think one of the good things out of all of this is 94% of the contributors are individuals. The remaining 6% are companies or political committees contributing to these campaigns. But you get to see who's given the most. And we can also, like, again, filter on a specific candidate. Right, so here, Jeremy has donated. He lent himself. There are no limits on loans for a candidate to personally give money to their own campaign. But you can also hover over and see, who else gave to any candidate. If we go to Mayor McLean, we can see all the various donors and hover over. You'll notice all these boxes are the same size because they're probably all $1,000 donations. Finally, in the interest of time, I'm going to switch over just real quick. At the very top, there's this bar. We'll switch, so you can switch. I was on donations and contributions. I've now switched to expenditures. So this is where they're spending their money. The map shows where they're spending their money around the United States. I can also, though, look at, all right, who is spending money where? I'm going to, again, filter to our friends at the City of Boise. So these are the categories in which the spending is being spent on, but you can see where are they spending, where are those candidates spending the various their monies. I can't read it well enough. There was one great one on here that I wanted to highlight. It was, let's see if I go to City Council, it'll pop up. I just thought it was fun. Yeah, Ubiquitous Unicorns Consulting, you can see. So Lisa Sanchez, obviously is the name of her campaign consultants. I just thought it was entertaining in terms of the name. But you can drill in and just search and filter with all this information. So I encourage you who are watching at home, hop onto the dashboard page and play around. Before I take a few questions, I'm just going to highlight real quickly. In addition to that dashboard, we also have a dashboard for lobbyists. There's not nearly as much information on the lobbyist page just because of what's available, but this is the same information I shared earlier, just another way to engage with information. So you can see what companies, how much they're spending in terms of lobbying. You can see the lobbyists who are registered and filter that information. We can highlight, again, where the spending is. Entertainment happens to be the most. If we want to pick on a particular lobbyist, here's Pat Sullivan. Well, I picked the wrong lobbyist, obviously. Here you go. Advertising, refreshments. Same concept as what I showed you with the campaign finance data between these tabs. We can look at the subjects in which they're lobbying on and filter that information and see, again, the whole purpose of this is to shed light on spending and money in politics. And so these tools are given away to give access to that information to the public. And I can say, at the beginning of next year, we are excited to roll out some new cool tools for all of you to be able to hop on the Secretary of State's page, tinker around, and especially for those investigative journalists in the room to try and connect the dots. We see lots of people who use this information. But the main thing is to, as we go back to our original, is to build confidence in our public officials and to see where money is coming and going in Idaho politics. I recognize I went a little bit long, Betsy, so I want to make sure to leave a few minutes for questions.
Okay, so remember that you can submit questions by email to idogquestions@gmail.com or write them on cards and hold them up and someone will bring them up here. Our first question from email goes back to your slide on when someone becomes a candidate. Is it when all the elements on the list are met or just one of them?
That is a great question. It's actually just one element. So they don't need to do all those things. It's only one element that has to be met. So it's usually what we see is spending their own money or making public announcements that they're running.
Mr. Secretary, in other states you see exploratory committees about possibly running for office. Based on kind of what you've shared, is that possible to have that in Idaho?
It's It's actually a very good question, because the way our laws are written is a little bit confusing to folks. The campaign finance requirements, we don't have exploratory committees, as the question's asked. Instead, we do see, though, candidates who will file appoint a political treasurer saying, I'm considering running for mayor, right? Just because you filed a campaign, appointed a treasurer, started raising and spending money, does not obligate anybody to actually file and run for that office. And we do see that. We see candidates who will file, they'll start to raise money and do their activity, and then they'll come to the realization, this isn't probably going to work out, and so they won't. So it works like the concept of an exploratory committee, that initial phase, but there is a disconnect. People often think when I file my campaign finance appointment of treasurer, that means I'm running. And there is no obligation. The creation of a campaign finance account is kind of like the creation of an exploratory committee. Now, mind you, many people treat it as though they're running and like as an announcement, but they are free not to, and we do see that happen, especially right around filing. There's always a little jockeying. Once everyone knows who's considering running for what, we'll see candidates withdrawal and other things that happen. But once the actual filing for office, so that's a separate filing that happens either with the Secretary of State's office for state offices, the county clerk for many of the other offices, or even like the city, that's when officially they become a candidate.
Our next question asks, it is difficult to lobby legislators whose offices are locked and who refuse to admit their constituents. How can citizens be heard in this case? Is this lawful? Is it ethical?
That's an interesting question, a bit outside my purview, but I want to touch on it because I think there's a couple of things that are interesting. Is lobbying, as I mentioned, to register as a lobbyist means that you are both either receiving compensation for the purposes of influencing it, or you're privately doing so. Anyone who comes down to the legislature, attends committee hearings, talks to legislators in the halls or whatever, does not have to register as a lobbyist. If you're doing it publicly through the public process, that's not necessarily lobbying. It has been interesting in terms of access. I will say, though, just from my personal experience, we're very fortunate to live here in Idaho where we have such open access in our Capitol building. I was recently with other secretaries of state, and I toured the Indiana Capitol building. Most Capitol buildings, so my peer, Michael Howe, he's from North Dakota. The North Dakota Capitol building requires you to go through security and go through checks to enter the Capitol building. Surprising a small state, we're very fortunate, and I hope that we continue to have an open process here in Idaho. I'll leave the other ethical questions to the legislature.
Phil, one of the question came in from email. It says, how do you determine whether there has been improper spending within a campaign? What qualifies as improper, or gifts for donors, etc.?
That's a great question. There actually are criteria in the Sunshine Laws in terms of what is acceptable for campaign finance spending. It's a good question. A campaign finance account really is like a trust account. The candidate is the trustee, and the donors are the beneficiaries trying to get that person elected to that office. The donations are not to the person. That is not the candidate's money. Usually, in terms of improper spending, it's what is referred to as conversion. It's taking that money, that campaign money, and trying to use it for yourself. So infamously, I'll pick on it, former Governor Kempthorne got in trouble once because he paid for a haircut with his campaign finance account, and no, you can't use your money for a haircut. So remember that, Controller Wolf. I don't have this problem. But that's where, so again, using money where we see this come up is like actually food expenses or travel expenses. Is you're allowed to use your campaign finance money to host an event, even if that event could be to raise more money and bring people together. It could be to thank your volunteers. You order pizza to say thank you to the volunteers. What you can't use it is to order a pizza for yourself and just sit and snack on the pizza, right? But candidates can use the money in addition to running for office and promoting themselves. One of my favorite descriptions is a campaign is like a startup of a marketing firm. You're like starting a small business, a small marketing firm, trying to start and raise it in a small period of time. But also campaign finance money can be used for current office holders. So as I'm sure you know, as I do, at times there's things that as part of promoting just what the office is doing, some of that money might be used by candidates as well.
Another great question. On the lobbying search, Can you search by a bill to see who lobbied for or against that bill?
Unfortunately, at this time, no. Our current tool does not allow for it, but it is something we want to try and look into. Not all lobbying activity is directly tied to a bill, but as you saw, lobbyists are supposed to report when they're lobbying on particular bills. Our hope is in the future that will be one of the fields that we can filter on and help people. Because I think there is an interest to see, like, especially some of the really big bills, you know, like this last year, school choice, for example. I think on both sides, people have an interest in seeing, like, who's for or who's against and what's happening.
This questioner says, thank you for gathering data. Does anyone regularly review to make sure the candidates are in compliance?
That's a great question. We, both at the Secretary of State's level, so I mentioned Cheryl Millard, we have an enforcement responsibility to look at that data as it's filed. Mind you, a lot of it comes in. Similarly, at the county clerk's level, that comes in. The other part is, I will say, part of why the idea of sunshine and making this data available is the public's participation in this. I can actually name people, maybe people even watching this stream, who are known to take this data and work with it, share some of the information and connect dots. If we see anything, we will pursue it, but also this is a participatory process where the public can also, if they spot something, we'll look into it. Ultimately, on the enforcement side too, the county clerks and the Secretary of State's office have more tools than you do publicly to look into to see whether there's a potential violation and whether it should be referred to the Attorney General or the prosecutor's office for final enforcement.
Sometimes you see campaign reporting that shows the individual, like you shared on the screen, the spouse, the business contribute the maximum amount, but it shows for the primary and the general election. So for example, a legislator gets $3,000 for the primary and $3,000 for the general. What happens when the candidate does not make it past the primary?
A great question, and oddly, this is a pain point for me. My office knows this. I'm not a big fan of the collecting money for the general election during the primary, so I'm telegraphing to those of you who are watching. The current secretary is not a big fan of that practice, but it does happen, and it has historically been allowed. Is that the limits are per election, so a primary election. Our office does go after, so after the primary elections, we will actually, it's easy enough for us to filter the data. We will actually police that information to follow up to make sure that candidates didn't spend money that was raised for the general election in their primary bid, and that they will return that money to the donors after the election.
What can a person do if they receive something in the mail that makes scurrilous charges and tells lies but doesn't say who it's from?
That's a tough one. It is fair. They should contact our office to try and look into it. There is, like, that is a violation, right? And we, to the extent that we can, and we'll do our investigatory work, we will fine. We do have fines that have been issued to candidates or political committees who didn't put the paid for by, you couldn't. Sometimes, you know, people even admit themselves that they've done it. I do think one of the things we're seeing is just so much more money flowing into the state. I think one of the topics we'll see in the upcoming legislature, it's kind of been a topic of recently, is out-of-state money coming into the state. As I showed on our map, just for the city of Boise or even the city of Eagle, like, we're seeing money from elsewhere, and so we're trying to look to enhance our tools and learn from the FEC, for example, on what can we do to bolster making sure that there's accurate reporting here in the state as to who's influencing our politics.
Maybe this is a great one to end on here. What are the top items that you still feel need to be updated in the Idaho legislature that relates to campaign finance?
Oh, I think there's, in terms of the campaign finance process, there's always this effort, as I already mentioned, looking at some of the out-of-state money or the political action fund committees, making sure that we get transparent reporting. I think through our new reporting system, we're looking at some additional enhancements and tools to make it easier for people to trace where that's coming from. For some of you who've seen me give presentations on campaign finance data in the past, one of my quirky things that I love to show is there's the Idaho Coalition for something, I can't think of it, but when I filter it, that Idaho PAC is actually located in Washington, D.C., right? It's not just because it has Idaho in its name doesn't mean that it's here in Idaho. The biggest thing is our goal is to try and get compliance from everybody in terms of more sunshine in terms of who's doing what. There are always efforts that we see for people to try and hide money in politics, and so I think our campaign finance law is just kind of updating them. The other part in terms of enhancing it, and this is probably a good place to end, really is trying to make it simple. Most candidates are just regular Idahoans who are trying to help their communities, and whether that's a city council member, whether that's a school trustee, even our legislators, it's not as nefarious as the public likes to believe, and the more we can shed light on that they're just good people and make it simple for them to comply. A legislator's focus should be on running for office and on legislating, not on the intricacies of campaign finance, and so hopefully we'll continue to get there as we roll out new tools. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully you enjoy the dashboard. It's a fun tool to play with.
Thanks very much, Phil. And thank you all for participating. Thank you to all our partners in this effort, and please look out for an email containing an evaluation survey. It will be from Gabe Osterhout of the Idaho Secretary of State's office. Please fill out the evaluation. It will help us improve our future presentations, and it will also include a chance for you to have direct input into suggesting which tools you think should be incorporated into the Secretary of State's office's new tools for online data reporting as they upgrade their system. You can go to openidaho.org for more information on IDOG and on how to support us, and on our upcoming events, which are October 25th, Idaho Open Meeting Law, featuring former Chief Deputy Attorney General Brian Kane and myself, and November 28th, Idaho Public Records Law, also featuring Brian and myself. Thanks again.